to a Duane lecture before? Okay, great. Any newcomers never seen Duane in the flesh? Welcome! Awesome! So this is a really cool presentation for a couple reasons. One, this is one that Duane, I don't think has ever really done before. So this is a new one, which is how I think we got a lot of you diehards in the audience tonight. Duane, his typical style is to give you full lecture first, so he's going to dive right into this historic storytelling. So be prepared for that. And then when he's ready, he'll give us a cue. Pepe, my lovely, wonderful, fantastic assistant back there, thanks Pepe and Suzette. Pepe's going to hit the lights when Duane's ready, so we'll dim this so that the screen's a little bit darker for the slideshow. So don't be worried about it. And that goes for you guys on Zoom as well. So you'll just be seeing the title screen while Duane is lecturing, and then you'll be hearing him as he goes through the slideshow. So, okay, without further ado, the man himself, author of almost a dozen books, history professor at Western since 1962, is that correct, Duane? And just foremost historian. Let's give it up for him. Duane!
Thank you very much, Elise, and thank you all for coming. The quiz will follow immediately after the presentation. It'll be men versus the women. I'm going to talk about the 10th Mountain Ski Division, which is a very famous one in the history of Colorado and the United States, and all of this has to be done with respect to World War II. So I'm going to start off by just saying that in 1939, Germany invaded Poland in September and World War II was underway. The United States would not get in the war for two years and 3 months. We didn't get into December of 1941. During the winter of 1939 and 40, this is a sideshow to the war. Russia invaded Finland to take that area before Germany did. And they expected a very easy win because when they went through Poland, they engaged in lightning mechanized warfare that they called the Blitzkrieg. Tanks and trucks, and the Poles had horse cavalry, so 27 days later Poland was taken and they thought they'd make short work of Finland. However, the Finns operated without tanks and trucks. They used guerrilla warfare. Not seen by the Russians, the Finns built a parallel system of ski trails and ice roads parallel in the forest to the highways. The skis allowed them to conduct lightning raids and ambushes. In white camouflage parkas, Finns would kick off their skis, get into firing position, attack, and then ski away to attack the Russians at a new location while the Russians floundered in deep snow and shelled an empty forest. During the winter of 1939 and 40, Russia lost 36,000 men to the Finns, and they never took them over. That action in World War II ended in March of 1940 when Russia and Finland signed a peace treaty because winter had ended and the Finns knew they had no chance against the Russians, so that ended it. The Finns had shown the value of skiers in winter fighting. One of the guys who took notice of this was the head of the National Ski Patrol, a guy named Minnie Dole. A little more about him later on. When the U.S. got in the war after Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941, Germany had taken over almost all of Europe. They had England on the ropes. The Japanese had taken all of Asia, and they had anything they had not taken on the ropes, and everything looked very bleak. The Germans had 3 divisions of mountain troops at the start of World War II, and they would soon have 14 by the end. It was said in the United States that we could fight in Maine in the summer and Florida in the winter, but not both. The military worried about a German attack from Canada and then south down to Lake Champlain and into New York. The same route that the English had taken invading the colonies in the Revolutionary War. There was also some bad worry about a possible attack in the high Sierras in the west. So there was a great need for mountain troops that could fight in the winter, either in the U.S. or, as most people thought, if we were lucky, in the Alps or the Pyrenees or the Apennines Mountains in Europe. We hoped that we wouldn't have to fight in the Rocky Mountains in the U.S., although a lot of people don't realize this. It looked pretty bleak in 1941 and 1942. A further example of the need for mountain and winter troops is what occurred when Italy invaded Greece in early World War II. They weren't organized, they weren't well clothed, they weren't well equipped, and they weren't trained for fighting in the winter in the mountains. Italy suffered heavy losses, as much from weather as they did from combat. Minnie Dole was an insurance executive from Connecticut. He was the founder of the National Ski Patrol, and he was the man who convinced President Roosevelt and the military that mountain troops who could fight in the winter were needed. In 1942, early, the National Ski Patrol was asked to recruit for the 87th Mountain Infantry, a new Army regiment of 2,500 men, soon to be known as the 10th Mountain Ski Division, or, quote, Minnie's troops. Eventually, there would be 14,300 men in the 10th Mountain Ski Division. The old silver camp of Pando was originally considered as a possible site. And very early in 1942, the initial training of the 10th Mountain was at Mount Rainier National Park on skis. And soon a search began for a permanent location. Locations were looked at in Colorado primarily. And they were looked at Ashcroft and Aspen and other areas. The final decision, however, was made to go to Pando, an old silver mining camp not far from Tennessee Pass and just north of Leadville, at 9,250 feet in elevation. It was in a flat valley. The Eagle River ran through it, 3 miles long, 1/2 mile wide. It had space, nearby electrical power, access by highway, heavy snowfall. The railroad ran right by there, and high mountains right above, and 250 inches of snow every year. And that's where construction began in April of 1942. $128 million was spent on barracks, a water system, sewage treatment plant, 4 theaters, incinerators, a field house, mess halls, rifle ranges, hospital, stables, firing ranges. Each one of the barracks held 63 men. The new name for Pando was Camp Hale, named for General Irving Hale, Denver-raised West Point grad who served in the Spanish-American War. It was isolated and right on the edge of the Sawatch Range. Now the Sawatch Range has 15 mountains, 14,000 feet or better, and they run from Salida in the south all the way to the Mount of the Holy Cross in the north. A lot of people refer to them as the collegiates, but the collegiates are only 5 of the 15, 14,000 footers. And you know the names, Oxford and Columbia and Harvard and Princeton and Yale. It is one of the great mountain ranges in all of America. Hardly any mountain range has that many over 14,000 feet in elevation. 7 miles south of the camp and over 1,000 feet higher on Cooper Hill just off Tennessee Pass, 2 6,000-foot long rope tows gave access to beginning, intermediate, and advanced slopes. They're put in. Those T-bars ran 7 miles an hour, and they ran up to 11,000 feet. One of the things that people don't know about Camp Hale is that 300 German prisoners of war were also there, which caused great tension. They ate 3 meals a day, and they didn't do very much work except clean the barracks. Recruiting films were made. One in 1941 showed 10 skiers performing synchronized powder skiing at Sun Valley. Recruits were in for a hell of a surprise when they arrived in Colorado. It wouldn't be skiing the powder. During the summer and fall of 1942, the first arrival of 14,300 men who would serve in the 10th Mountain at Camp Hale began to appear. Many were already top skiers and jumpers, and they came from many countries. They included Paul Pitzal, a Wyoming climber who had gotten to 26,000 feet on K2 in 1938. Friedel Pfeiffer from St. Anton in Sun Valley. Tony Mott, the best downhiller in the world. David Brower, who later on began the Sierra Club. Torger Tokel, the best ski jumper in the world from Norway. Others included Bob Parker, Pete Seibert, and Sarge Brown, who helped start Vail after the war. Larry Jump started Arapahoe Basin. Walter Prager helped start Squaw Valley. Alf Angdon started Alta. Bill Bowerman began Nike. John Jay, the famous photographer. Dick Durrance, a legendary skier who came out of Austria. And Fritz Benedict, who became a very important man in the early days of Aspen. He was an architect. Most of the 14,300, however, had to be taught to ski. And they also had to be taught how to snowshoe. 120 instructors, most of which lived at Cooper Hill near the rope toes, did the instruction. Many recruits did not have basic training, so they got it in small groups based on their arrival date. All buildings were heated by coal. Smoke from furnaces along with that from coal-fired locomotives of the Denver and Rio Grande created a persistent cough among the men called the Pando hack. And a big haze was always over that camp at 9,250 feet. It was called Pandermania. The elevation, it was the same elevation, 9,250 feet, that any Air Force flyer was required to put on his oxygen mask when you got to that elevation. And here you were on the ground at that elevation. Along with the men, hundreds of mules were brought to Camp Hale. Southern recruits who didn't know the first thing about skiing were recruited because of their experience with mules. Now, the mules were very important to the success of the 10th Mountain. Whenever I talk about Colorado and the mining frontier, I say the same thing about the burros. Without burros, this area would never have opened. And there's a great book by a man named P. Davis Smith called On the Backs of Burros, which shows the importance of them in mining in Colorado. And of course, we're talking about mules now.
That book's available in the gift shop.
There you go, yeah. 10th Mountain Artillery consisted of 75 millimeter howitzers. They could be broken up into 6 parts, which one mule could carry. When snow became too deep for mules, the 10th experimented with motorized and non-motorized toboggans. You'll see some of that when we show the slides here. The 10th Mountain Ski Division learned lessons on the fly. They used nylon instead of hemp ropes, which shredded. They ate high-quality, high-calorie food, which didn't weigh much. When nylon tents did not work because of the frost and the snow at night, caved them in, they dug snow caves. They learned to keep their boots next to their bodies at night. They learned to use crampons, and a lot of trial and error. Artillery rounds, they found out, caused avalanches near Camp Hale. It impressed the 10th, who saw that as a possible effective thing in battle. The culmination of training came in March and April of 1944, a 3-week maneuver called D-Series. 12,000 men took part in mock battles in severe winter conditions outside of Camp Hale. Skis on, 90-pound packs on their backs, cold weather, heavy snow. The men lived in snow caves. It was called the most rigorous training in the history of the American Army. When finished, everybody knew the 10th was ready for combat. When men of the 10th Mountain Ski Division had breaks in their training, They went to Aspen to ride the boat tow 500 yards up on Ajax Mountain and then skied the Powder back down. Some were taken by Billy Taggart with horse and wagon up on the flanks of Mount Hayden and then skied down. Others went to Climax and rode the rope tow across from the Climax molybdenum mine and skied on the flanks of Chalk Mountain. In Aspen, they slept on the floor of the now nearly vacant historic Jerome Hotel for free. To stay there and stay warm, they drank a drink of a thick chocolate malt shake spiked with 5 shots of bourbon called Aspen Crud. They didn't get cold when they drank that drink. They also sang a legendary song. Their systems and theories of skiing. But one thing I surely have found, skiing's just good in the winter, but the drinking's good all year round. The 10th spent the summer training at Fort Swift, Texas. Nobody could ever figure out why the hell, even them, could figure out why the hell they were at Fort Swift, Texas. And then in December went to Virginia, and then by boat across the Atlantic Ocean, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and landed in Italy near Naples. From there they became part of General Mark Clark's 5th Army, which had been stalled by the Germans in the north-south Apennines Mountains as the Germans held the high ground. Now the Allies and the Americans had landed on the west side of Italy at a place called Salerno in late 1943 and Anzio in January of 44. It took them 57 days to get off the beach at Anzio. And Albert Kesselring was the German commandant. Now the Apennines Mountains run north and south right up the middle of Italy. And all the Germans had to do was defend the high ground. So they had different lines, the Gothic line, the Kesselring line. And when at high cost, you would take one of those peaks, then you had to go up another set of peaks. So it was very slow going, and the fighting in Italy became very controversial regarding whether or not that really was needed. The cost and the time element were tremendous. By January, the 10th Mountain was in position at the foot of the mountains. Most of their ski gear had been left home. They would now count on their mountain climbing ability and fitness. When they landed in early 1945, the new general was now a fellow by the name of General George Hayes, who took over in late 1944, early 1945. General Hayes, I've just jotted a word or two down. General Hayes won the Medal of Honor in World War I, commanded units in Italy and France before taking over the 10th. No-nonsense general. Visited men in the hospital, unlike other generals, loved by the men. Lucian Truscott, one of the generals in Italy and Germany, said this: "One of the ablest battle leaders I ever knew. Fit the 10th Mountain Ski Division like a well-worn and well-loved glove." So now they are at the foot of the mountains outside of Naples. The Italian campaign was the brainchild of English Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who called it the soft underbelly of Europe. However, trying to take that high ground had taken 52,000 casualties before Mark Clark's 5th Army took Rome on June the 4th, 1944. They just didn't make very much progress. It was still a long way from there to the Alps. By January of 45, the 10th Mountain had made its way to northwest of Florence, with most of the advance made at night. Barring their way to the Po Valley and the Alps and Brenner Pass and Austria was Mount Belvedere and Riva Ridge. Now, Mount Belvedere was where some of the heaviest fighting went on, and that was the key to the German defense. From there, they had a clear sight to see below and into the valley down below. Now, Riva Ridge. In October and November of 44, there were 2 attempts to capture Mount Belvedere by the 5th Army. In both attacks, they had ignored Riva Ridge. Mount Belvedere was the main objective, and General Hayes knew he had to do something about the Germans on the ridge, because from there they had clear view of approaches to the summit of Mount Belvedere, which allowed them to call in artillery fire. To take the ridge, the 10th had to scale a steep set of cliffs. Germans thought that was impossible and did not keep that side of the ridge under close observation. An advance party scouted possible trails and fixed ropes on 5 routes. Hayes now ordered troops in their first combat mission to advance in the dark, up steep and treacherous terrain, to assault the Germans who held the high ground. 50 Germans were on top of the ridge and 200 were behind them. At 7:30 p.m. on February 18, 1945, the 10th moved up in single files on 5 routes. A heavy fog helped them. 6 hours later, at 1:30 in the morning, Riva Ridge was taken with no casualties. The taking of Riva Ridge. 12,000 men of the 10th now made their way to their jumping off point below Mount Belvedere. On the mountain, there was no chance for troops to reach the tops before the Germans knew they were coming. The 10th was hit with mortars, mines, machine gun fire as they moved up. In some cases, fighting was hand-to-hand. Belvedere and other peaks nearby were taken on February the 25th. When it was all over, the fighting on Mount Belvedere, the 10th had suffered 923 casualties and 192 dead. Bayonets, grenades, and knives were used. One man in the 10th Mountain Division said, a platoon leader, "The Italian snow was corn from all that sunlight. If we'd had powder, we could have used them for patrols. A few attempts had been made at night, but were stopped because the Germans could hear us coming. The sound of skis on corn was loud." One of the guys who was killed in the fighting at Mount Belvedere was the greatest ski jumper in the world, Torger Tokel, who was killed by shrapnel. In March, there was a lull in the fighting as both sides regrouped. Then, on April the 14th, the Allied spring offensive began with the 10th Mountain spearheading the assault. One of the guys wounded in the fighting that went on in early April was a fellow by the name of Robert Dole from Kansas, who later on became a United States Senator and ran for president. He was hit in the arm by shrapnel and his right arm was no good to him. He kept it on, but he couldn't use it for the rest of his life. As they fought north through the Apennines and towards the Alps, the 10th again took heavy casualties. One of the wounded was a man named Pete Seibert, who would later start Vale. An exploding shell left him with wounds to his head, torso, arms, and legs. Most of his teeth were knocked out and his right kneecap was blown off. He spent 1.5 years in the hospital, but amazingly recovered. On April the 20th, the mountain troops had broken out of the mountains and into the Po Valley, way ahead of the 5th Army. The rapid advance to the Po forced many Germans to surrender. The 10th now raced north towards Brenner Pass, hoping to trap the Germans in Italy. They hit very heavy resistance at Lake Garda and the mountains that were there. When they finally got to the lake on May the 2nd, they got word that all German troops in Italy had surrendered. 5 days later, it was VE Day. The war in Europe was over. A funny story came out of high-ranking German officers surrendering just before the war ended. General Mark Clark put them in a villa wired with listening devices. After several days, Clark had learned nothing. He then gave them a couple of cases of whiskey, and within hours learned valuable information. One of the things the Germans said was that the 10th Mountain Division was made up, quote, of physically superior soldiers. In 114 days of combat, Out of 14,300 men, the 10th Mountain Ski Division lost 992 and had 4,154 wounded. Tokal was one of the best known. Robert Balch, whose family started Winter Park, was another one well known. The 10th got 46 silver stars and 1 Congressional Medal of Honor. The Congressional Medal of Honor winner was a man named John McGrath of Connecticut, who got the medal for cleaning out several German machine gun nests on April the 14th. 2 hours later, killed by mortar fire the same day. The 10th had helped destroy 5 German divisions, had trained for over 2 years, fought for 5 months, and won every mountain battle in Italy. The 10th was briefed on the Pacific War. They expected to be involved in the invasion of Japan. While en route from Italy to New York in August, they heard the atomic bombs had been dropped on Japan. They docked in New York on August the 11th. After a 30-day furlough, they reported for duty at Fort Carson in Colorado. In September, they were discharged. Many of them, as I already mentioned, went on to do other things after the war was over, including starting a lot of ski areas. Norman Mailer, the author, was a member of the 10th Mountain Ski Division. Jerry Cunningham, how do you pronounce that with the backpacks and tent equipment, Gary or Jerry?
Oh.
I say Jerry. Anyway, he was the guy that was also in the 10th Mountain Ski Division. When World War II came to an end, and I remember this vividly, listening to it on the radio at 8 years old, prosperity came. And prosperity came because people had not been able to spend money during the war. And now the war was over, and everybody had a little money and started to spend. Great growth came in automobile ownership, and now people could travel a lot farther than they ever traveled before. Some of you don't understand that, but in World War II, you had a limit of 3 gallons of gas per week. You're not going anywhere on 3 gallons of gas a week. I still have the rationing book that my mother gave me before she passed away. You got to have rationing stamps to get the flour and get the sugar and so forth. A little different time. The interstate highway system began. 100,000 pairs of skis were declared Army surplus and very cheap. And the return of the 10th Mountain Ski Troops brought a great boom in skiing. Very few ski areas had existed before, and most of them had rope tows. You know, in Colorado during the winter of 39 and 40, 4 areas opened up and they closed during World War II. Pioneer right out here at Cement Creek. Wolf Creek Pass, Monarch, and Winter Park, that was it. You might have a boat tow, you might have a rope tow. You sure as hell didn't have gondolas or trams or anything like that. The 10th Mountain Division, the men always called themselves the original ski bums. A newsletter, The Blizzard, came out with 10th Mountain news, and reunions came every year in different areas of the U.S. The esprit de corps was great. Still is. Significance of the 10th Mountain Ski Division. Everybody learned about specialized mountain and cold weather training and fitness being the key to victories and set a precedent for later. Lessons were learned about cold weather equipment and cold weather clothing that worked in the winter. The effect that the 10th Mountain Ski Division had on post-war skiing was enormous. Many resorts were started by men who came back, and I'm just going to give you a few. Squaw Valley, A-Basin, Aspen, Alta, Vail, and Taos. Many men never forgot Colorado. They came back and they started ski areas here. They headed ski schools. They were the first backcountry skiers. They were in ski patrols, managed resorts, started ski magazines, began ski competitions. The National Association of the 10th held reunions, maintains 40 memorials and monuments to the 10th, and created a network of 17 backcountry huts in Colorado. On the top of Tennessee Pass today, there is a stone monument with the names of all who died in World War II. And the Cooper Hill ski area is still nearby. It opened up as Ski Cooper in 1945. Camp Hale was Pass. Where's the guy from Waterton, New York? The 10th still trains out there, right?
Yeah.
So 10th Mountain Division still exists in skiing today. All right, enough said. I'm going to sit down and shut my mouth. We're going to take a look at the slides. So here we go. Lights out.
I forgot.